and am also the chairperson of the JASPA Webinar Committee. And on behalf of the JASPA Webinar Committee, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for our second webinar. Today's program will focus on best practices for supporting the LGBTQI community at Jesuit institutions. This is a topic that many of our members have expressed interest in, and as a result, we're very excited to be able to offer this program this afternoon. We're fortunate to be joined by three resident experts who have extensive experience working in the Jesuit context, specifically with LGBTQI initiatives and programs, and they're going to be sharing with us some of their ideas with regards to what we all can be doing on our respective campuses to be more inclusive and welcoming environments for the LGBTQI community. Before we get started with our webinar, I just want to point out a few highlights of our platform. Much of our discussion this afternoon will be question and answer, so we encourage our participants to submit questions for consideration throughout the webinar. To do that, simply go to your toolbar under the chat or question tabs and enter your questions, and we'll be sure to provide those questions to our panelists for answers once we get to that portion of our program. So without further ado, I'd like to start by asking our panelists to each introduce themselves. They're going to say a word or two about some of the work that they've done around this particular topic or community, and then we'll get into the meat of our program. So first up, I'd like to turn things over to Dr. Susanna Bartlow, representing Marquette University.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be able to step in, and I appreciate I am probably the newest to Jesuit education of the rest of the folks on this panel, so I also am really excited to learn from the people on the call as well as the other panelists, and so just really grateful for the opportunity. I actually came to this work through doing a PhD in feminist literature. I was interested in social movement history, especially racial justice and the feminist movement, and have had some, in my career, had some early involvement in nonprofit work and started organizing campus programs as a graduate student in 2003. In 2008, I joined as the first director of the Women's Center at Dickinson College, which is in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and then in 2012 I joined Marquette as my first experience of Jesuit education. So part of what I'm bringing to the table is just both coming in from a feminist education background as well as coming in as someone who most of my education and experience has actually been in secular education, and now joining Jesuit education because I have this interest in spirituality and social justice as part of what was interesting to me about joining this community, and just really learned a lot, particularly from Shiva, so really honored to be on the call with Shiva, and also hoping to learn a lot from folks here. I think, is there a next slide related to the work that's happening at Marquette?
Yeah.
There we go. Great. Thank you. So the Marquette Gender and Sexuality Resource Center opened in 2012. I came here to start as the director. There we go. Can everybody see me? Just give a shout if you can see me. Okay, great. Thank you. So I came here to found the center. It's actually a hybrid center, so we do, or a bridge center. We do education and empowerment based in the Office of the Provost on gender, sex, and sexuality. So sometimes when I'm talking to students in particular, I frame it as a women's and LGBT center in one. We support research and scholarship, so we have faculty and residents at the center, and I go into a lot of classes and do guest lectures. We do educational programs on campus, so the kind of like campus activities that you might think of coming out of an LGBT student services office, or that I know, a lot of campus educational programs come out of the LGBTQ Resource Center at Georgetown. We do some services and support on campus as well, but those are kind of the three main areas that we work in. We have so my role is full-time director. I teach one course a year, and I report to the Associate Provost for Diversity and Inclusion on campus. I also have a half-time program assistant here at the center. The person who's in that role now is an experienced community educator who's also an arts educator. And then I have a couple student staff who do between 8 and 10 hours a week. So we are on Facebook and Twitter. You can follow us and see what we're doing kind of day in, day out. The final piece in terms of our structure is that we have an advisory board that's comprised of faculty, staff, students, and community members, including an alum representative. and community representative from a community organization. So that's a kind of big picture snapshot of the center itself. In terms of our programs, we do a couple different things. What I thought I would do is just kind of highlight the things that we do as a center that wouldn't happen if we didn't organize them, and then a handful of the partnerships that we're doing. So I'll start with the stuff that's on the right-hand screen of this slide. We have a Safe Zone program, which I'm happy to talk about in more detail if that's helpful for folks. We based it off of related curricula at Creighton, Loyola Maryland, Fairfield, and now I'm forgetting the fourth, but we based it off of the combined curricula of 4 different Jesuit institutions, as well as kind of general research on Safe Zone on campus. Although Safe Zone programs have a lot of limitations, we felt like for where Marquette is as a community, it's helpful to have some kind of a campus-wide educational program that would help to build capacity among people on campus to provide support for LGBTQ students. The additional thing I want to kind of elevate about Safe Zone is that we do require everyone who is trained in the Safe Zone program to also be trained in our Diversity Advocates program within the first year if they want to retain certification, which more or less means we're not going to come around and rip the sticker off their door and that kind of thing, but we want to make sure that people are really being trained to push themselves to think intersectionally about gender and sexuality. We do kind of some typical educational programs. We try to do a lot of co-sponsorship because of our limited resources. We have a trans inclusion work group. I have not been able to steward that process as quickly as I would like, but right now we're working on a draft of a trans resource guide. And then the final piece that is kind of a owning program that the center operates is that I do some course consultation, as I mentioned, in the research and scholarship section on LGBTQ identity. I also do some individual student support and outreach around gender identity and coming out. In terms of general programs for student services, I also wanted to mention that there are a number of campus partners who've already been doing this work for a long time on this campus, and a couple of those are our partners in intercultural engagement. And our goal as a partnership this year is to do student of color outreach, particularly around LGBTQI identity. So we've taken a couple different approaches to trying to do that. I'm happy to talk more about that. There are some folks in campus ministry who are also really committed, really strong allies. And so one of their projects this year, they take a couple different approaches, but one of the projects they do is an LGBTQ and Allies monthly mass. I also am the advisor, this is brand new, but I'm the advisor to the Campus Gender Sexuality Alliance. So those are a handful of the programs that we're connected with that I wanted to highlight. We're really kind of a one-size-fits-all, or just kind of a hub, a network space. So there are a lot of different things going on, and I don't want to take up too much time, but that's the general overview.
I think you need to go next, Stacy.
I think I do.
Stacy.
Sorry, I'll just go ahead. Hi, my name is Stacy Green. I'm the Assistant Dean of Students at Regis University, and I recently just returned to Regis after previously being at Boston College for the last 3 years. So today I'm going to try to talk a little bit about my experience at both institutions, which are very, very different from one another in most ways, but primarily I think I will probably be speaking quite a bit about my experience at Boston College, where serving LGBTQ student population was actually a formal part of my job description. So I'll speak to that there. Take that next slide when you have a chance, Casey. Thank you so much. So just to run through some of the differences here, and you can throw all these up at once if you like, Casey. Thank you for your help. My columns got a little off here, but just again to give you a feel, similar mission, right? We all share as Jesuit institutions the basic same philosophy and same goals, but very different student atmosphere. Here at Regis in Denver, we have just under 2,000 traditional aged undergraduate students. That's in comparison to at Boston College, where we were serving around 9,000 traditional undergrads in a very, very heavily residential population. Different, again, from Regis, where a lot of students are commuting or are from the greater Colorado area. You can obviously see some large differences there in terms of our operating budgets, our endowments. So just the overall infrastructure has been very different, and particularly in terms of the size of the Jesuit community, a pretty stark difference there. Next slide, please. So just to speak first a little bit to some of my experience at BC, as I mentioned, I was the first staff member with serving the LGBTQ community as an actual portion of my job description. I can talk a little bit about the ways in which that happened, but I was working as an assistant dean of students in a case management capacity, really serving students in crisis and distress. And when my position became a permanent position, there was an opportunity to add in some language into my description about serving LGBTQ identifying students as a liaison, as a support person, as a resource person. Now, I should add that that was done. There were no other changes to the rest of the job description or kind of additional budget. This wasn't intended to be a separate resource center or an academic center, as Susanna has just talked about at Marquette. So really, this was a first major step, though, in the right direction of having someone have that formal responsibility to serve LGBTQ identifying students. So a little bit of background there. And what that entailed was certainly in providing individual student support. That would include on the negative side of things, if there were bias-related incidents or concerns that would come up, certainly I would be in the loop working with students around those issues, but also just in terms of general student support. And that fit very well with the rest of my position and what I was doing in the rest of the position. There was an element of supporting student organizations, of which we had many. And I should just give a shout out to the students at BC who are such incredible student leaders and really have put together a lot of the existing programming that has gone on at BC around education for the community. A lot of that in the past has been very, very student driven, and so I want to recognize that as well. And then also partnering with other campus organizations. Boston College has a very active faculty and staff organization that has been a tremendous resource for our students in many, many ways. And also several of those staff members put together what they call the Rainbow Alliance in the last couple of years to bring together all of these organizations under one umbrella and to put together some common programming, such as we just this past spring had the second annual Lavender graduation ceremony, marched for the second time in the Boston Pride Parade. So some important changes going on in that area as well. The program that I will probably speak the most to today, because I do think it has the most applicability to other Jesuit peer institutions, was a retreat program that we ran called Spectrum Weekend. That we didn't actually devise that program all on our own. It actually came out of the Center for Student Formation, which is a part of our Division of Mission and Ministry. But eventually, in the last 2 years, the Dean of Students Office took that program over with a lot of success with students, and so I certainly hope to speak to that a little bit more today. We also, just as one other example, created a GLBTQ resource guide that has a lot of basic information, but has certainly been a good starting point. And a lot of my work was also just trying to get that information, as well as other information, more accessible, more visible than it had been previously. One of the biggest changes that we had during my time there was actually being able to include that guide for the very first time in orientation and welcome week folders for students. That was not something that had been done previously, and we were excited to be able to just give that information to students right up front. As well as really starting to become more involved in trainings on campus for RAs, as well as other groups. Again, that's not something that we've previously been able to have a lot of involvement in, although certainly some training in this area had been done previously. So that was an exciting change. And then the last piece on here, we created a graduate assistantship during my time there. I think Mark, our grad assistant, may actually be listening over in Boston. Just a really tremendous resource for our students. I personally identify as an ally, and so there were certainly things that, conversations to be had with students or things that I could be involved in, but it needed a different voice in many ways, and you know, our grad assistant was often able to provide that additional perspective. So creating that additional staff member to be able to keep the conversation moving forward when I would get sucked into student emergency number 4 for the day was really, really important. So some of the basic background about that position at BC. And then at Regis, the work here has been very different. As I mentioned, the population and the needs are different, but we're really trying to focus on meeting students' needs where they are. We've had a registered student organization here on campus for approximately 10 years. They're faculty advised, they're student fee supported, and they do a lot of really nice programming and, again, some good connectivity between our faculty and staff on campus as well. So working with that organization on an ongoing basis. And then also one relatively new effort in the past couple of years, our counseling center, our counseling and personal development office, has started an LGBTQ support group, which has been really beneficial for a lot of our students who perhaps weren't comfortable being involved in the student organization or were looking for something slightly different. I think we always have to be careful that the automatic referral isn't just to counseling. I think that has a lot of other implications tied up in there that we certainly don't want students ever to feel that, oh, you're gay, go to counseling. That's not at all what we were hoping to do. But in fact, Regis has had a lot of success because of the tone that our counseling staff has set in running a really, really helpful support group. So that's some of my background. I certainly don't consider myself to be quite the expert that Shiva is, and I'm looking forward to learning from her today as well. But hopefully my experience really working at sort of some of the more initial levels and ground levels of this work will be helpful for others who are on this call today. Thank you.
Thanks, Stacey. Shiva?
Hi, I'm Shiva. I'm at Georgetown, and I think after the build-up from the two of you, I have to sort of say something. It's really been sort of an honor to be here at Georgetown as the first director of a fully funded institutional center. And I always say that because I think often people don't, the significance of the center here was that it is the first institutionally funded. We have 2 full-time staff, and from the beginning it was 2 full-time staff. So there's a director and there's an assistant director, and it was a program coordinator position that I've now been able to elevate to an assistant director position. I have 4 undergraduate students and a graduate student now. So I think so from the beginning, when Georgetown decided to do it, they did it on a very different template institutionally, and so I think that is what has really allowed us or given us the space, but more importantly, given us the permission and the authority really to make the sort of campus-wide change. The second piece is how we were born, so to speak, as a center. It really came out of student activism, and it came from hate crimes that happened on campus in the fall of '07. And it was a student-on-student hate crime which went unreported on campus. So Georgetown then responded by setting out, the students protested for weeks and months, and then finally the president did a town hall and announced the formation of 3 working groups. And I've talked a lot about these working groups when I've done workshops and so on, but I think that I really want to draw your attention to the working groups. All those working group reports are available online. Fundamentally, those working groups were made up of everyone from the campus community. It was made up of faculty, staff, students, and most importantly, campus ministry. So from the beginning, those working groups determined how they were going to shape the vision and mission of the center. So the reason I have the Hoya Pride up there is for 2 reasons. One, I think philosophically when I thought about doing this work, it was exciting, it was a wonderful opportunity. I myself am a product of 23 years of Catholic education in India, so I think I've had more Catholic education than most in this country, because all through school and college, my undergraduate as well as my master's degree, everything was Catholic. So the culture is very familiar to me, and so that was what helped me. But I think when we got here, the most important thing for me was to think about, I think when we often think about making change on a campus, and often doing diversity work, LGBTQ work is about making change, I think we think of change as resistance. I think of it as alignment. That it is about aligning our work with the mission, vision, and values of the institution. So from the beginning, my approach was more about saying, but this is, doing this work is part of our Jesuit values. It is part of our identity. And this is not about resistance. This is not about that. And so one of the visual ways we did the branding was by using the Hoya. Because, when I first got here, I had no clue what the Hoya was. I was like, what the hell is that? And then, but everybody loved being a Hoya. It's a very real identity on this campus and a very unifying identity because from the day you come to Georgetown, you're branded Hoya. And so we put in a pink triangle there. I thought I would get yelled at, but nothing happened. So it stayed. But just to give you a sense of, this is the sense of belonging, right? Because at the end of the day, this is about you're part of the community on the hilltop. And you're not separate. You're not that, you have as much a Hoya as everybody else is a Hoya. So next slide, please. So I've been here 6 years. So this is the beginning of our 7th year, and a lot has happened in this 7 years. We've been somewhat lucky, and some of it is a lot of hard work. But I think we have a lot of programs, and a lot of it is on the web. So I won't go into much of that, but we do a whole about, we do something called Outober in fall for LGBT History Month. So we do like a bunch of speakers, events, workshops, and we branded it as Outober rather than LGBT History Month. In spring, I do this retreat, which is LGBT specific, called Journeys. We actually did it as an overnight retreat, but it's completely modeled on an Ignatian retreat. It's non-denomination, obviously, but we do it specifically around, I call it Journeys, the journey from self to community. Because part of the question that we are interested in is how can LGBT students become more, as they become more aware of themselves, how do they build or create community? And we do this actually in our retreat center where all the other retreats are held. So that has been really a powerful sort of program to do. Like Susanna and Stacy talked about, we work extensively with campus ministry. I also work a lot with the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. So the one thing that we have done, even though we are located in Street Affairs, is to do a lot of work with academic departments. So because academic departments have more freedom, and so, but for me, the reason to partner with academic departments is actually quite simple, because we need to really elevate the conversation and deepen the conversation, right? Because a lot of times LGBTQ work is seen as being simply about support. And and while that is important, it's not always about support. It's also about knowledge. It's about knowledge production. It's about knowing our histories. It's about knowing all the research that is out there on this community. So it's not really about hand-holding alone. So I do want to put that out there. The next slide, please. So we did lavender graduation, and the reason I have this up here is because this is the door of the Dahlgren Chapel here. But it's again for me a piece of the visual stuff. To say again that our work and who we are is part of this community. It's not, so I don't do a lot of rainbows. I don't do a lot of that. So we use the Dahlgren Chapel door as a way to symbolize that we are at the heart and core of this campus community. So lavender graduation has grown to be a very, very large ceremony for us. We began with 25 students 6 years ago. Last year we had 140 students participate, but it also includes graduate students. It includes the law school, the medical school, and the School of Continuing Studies, and the undergraduate students. So it has now become the only ceremony on this campus that actually cuts across all schools. So that's been interesting. The president comes for it, all of the vice presidents, the deans, the faculty. So it's become a sort of a very strong and powerful end of the year celebration of this community and what can happen on the community. Next one. I think that's, so these were two things that I just put up if you all want to look at it, just to give you a sense of the sort of the range of events we do for October and the kind, but most of my work is done from an intersectional lens, and to say that LGBTQ communities are not and cannot be understood separately from any other community of which we are a part. And the only other thing I will speak to, but I didn't put the slides up here, is the extensive alumni outreach we have done from the center. So a big part of my work has been to find LGBTQ alums who are very angry, disenfranchised from the campus. And we've been able to engage them in very many different ways. So I do homecoming, reunion, we do the big annual John Carroll Alumni Weekend. And as some of you may know, we also received a $1 million endowment from an ally who also happened to be the chairman of our board of directors and the former NFL Commissioner Paul Tagliabue. But that $1 million endowment, more than the money, I think the piece about it that is important is that it came from a straight ally. And we often forget that alumni can be also straight people who are interested in supporting us. And two, that it's again, once again, elevated the importance of this work vis-a-vis others. So that's where I will leave it.
Great. Thank you all for that wonderful introduction. I'd like to now start with the question and answer portion of our program. And at this point, I'd like to remind our audience, if you have questions for our panelists, please submit them via the chat or the question toolbar on the left, and we'll pose those questions as we receive them. I'd like to pose the first question. How do we reconcile our desire to be inclusive communities for the LGBTQ community while honoring the Jesuit Catholic identity of our institutions?
I'm happy to go for that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, like I said earlier, I don't think it's, I think it is consistent with our Jesuit values, because ultimately if we are about flourishing and formation, which are the two sort of deepest educational values of Jesuit education, I think what we do in our centers is about the formation of conscience. It is about the formation of ethical decision making, and it is the right of all students, regardless of who they are, to have the access to the tools they need so that they can fully flourish in their educational experience.
I think language that we've also used a lot touches on the principle of social justice and seeing this work as an inherently social justice issue. I can actually read a statement Regis used for National Coming Out Day this fall. We had a statement in the student newspaper where various faculty, staff, and students could indicate their support of the statement, and it's just very brief, but I think it encapsulates some of what Shiva just spoke about. It said, in support of Regis University's Jesuit Catholic mission and the principles of human dignity, which supports those who are marginalized because of their sexual orientation and/or gender identity, as well as their allies, we desire a safe and inclusive campus environment for all members of the Regis community that promotes respect, compassion, and sensitivity toward all. So I think sometimes including some of that social justice language can also be a powerful connector to our broader mission as well.
Yeah, I think I just want to second everything that Shiva and Stacy have said. I think at Marquette, some of the language around Cura Personalis seems to resonate for people as a piece of supporting students and other community members to flourish. So that is another dimension that might be helpful for different campuses, depending on which aspects of the Jesuit language and educational tradition resonate with your campus, whatever your campus really strongly identifies with. I have yet to find and have really strong support from both our campus ministry and our larger office of mission and ministry. Very supportive, very clear with us that this is not something that needs to be reconciled. It's something that is already there that needs to be elevated and understood and integrated into our daily lives. And so I think building that support in partnership and also understanding which pieces of the Jesuit mission really resonate on campus and are really core to why people are drawn there and why people stay. I've definitely found that to be helpful. Also, even in just my own learning process as a professional, to be able to better understand that language and not, the language is not the same as it may be used in other educational contexts that deal with some issues. And so I think being able to do some of that translation work for myself has also been helpful.
Great. Thank you. We have our next question. What successes have the panelists had in bringing together queer students of color? And what tips might you offer to campuses that are interested in starting initiatives for students of color that also identify with the LGBT community? And I pose that question to any of you.
I can jump in because it's something that we're working on that we haven't had much success at so far. And part of that, I think, is because, well, there's a couple things that I think are going on, but one of the things that we found right away is that the language of queer students of color does not resonate with many of our students, that they, even if they do identify as a racial or ethnic minority, or if they do identify with a strong, specific racial community, that they do not, the language of being a student of color or a person of color doesn't resonate, or that the language of queer doesn't resonate in particular. So the other thing that's in play is that I'm white, and I think a lot of people see, as I'm the only full-time staff person, a lot of people see me as defining the work of the center in some way, or associating the center, and so trying to do that work in a way that makes sure that that doesn't happen, or that it doesn't happen in a way that might be alienating for students. So part of the strategy has been to partner with our Center for Intercultural Engagement and to support, provide a lot of resources and support, but get out of the way so that the faculty and staff of color who are invested in the work and really want to do the work, it's not to place it on them, but to really not get in the way and assume that I can serve as some kind of a white savior coordinating a group that I don't identify with, that I may not always be able to respond to, and at the same time do my work to try to be effective in supporting it. So right now we're just working on outreach. Our program assistant, who identifies as Chicana and as queer, is doing a lot of outreach to individual student organizations just to try to build relationships and try to get increase that trust. And we are showing up to as many events that are sponsored by of color organizations to just to try to build those strong coalitions and those relationships so that we can lay the foundation for trust, because there's not a lot of infrastructure here. Marquette also in general has a lot of issues with racism on campus, so I think that's one of the things that we've been trying to work really actively on in other ways. I serve in a lot of diversity committees and do a lot of other projects that are related to racial justice issues at Marquette and in Milwaukee. So trying to work there is also a component of what I think strong work for queer students of color also means, just showing up for racial justice work as well. So.
I would say one thing that we struggled with at BC, and I imagine is probably an ongoing issue there, Caroline Davis, who now has my role, can probably speak to this more in depth. But I know that one thing that we really struggled with was that we really had very little data about our students, period. And I shouldn't say period, I guess, about LGBTQ identifying students. And that was really because that information wasn't really asked anywhere, and so students weren't really given the opportunity to self-identify. And that was certainly a work in progress, but I think that that was a challenge, again, when you're looking at this intersectionality of identity, to really figure out, who are we talking about? What are the numbers? What are we looking at here? And I think, data underlies everything that we do, so that was certainly an issue that overlaps into this work. In terms of actual efforts that were taken to address that, I would say that one thing that we were very conscious of doing with Spectrum Weekend, the retreat program that I mentioned, was we used student leaders in that program, and we were always, as much as humanly possible, trying to work to recruit as well as to select, choose a wide range of students identifying within the LGBTQ spectrum, but also students, including students of color there as well, because that retreat was very much focused on identity in a very broad sense, and not just on the lens of LGBTQ. So we really looked to put student leaders in front of other students to be able to be vulnerable and open about experience and to be able to talk about the importance of that intersectionality. So that was one relatively small way, but a small way that we addressed that overlapping issue that you've asked about.
Great.
I'd say, Susan, I'm here as a woman of color. It doesn't make such a substantive difference, in who comes in through the door. I think that is mostly institutional, and it's also in our culture. Institutionally, we are organized as identity-based centers, right? So we have multicultural centers. So if you're a person of color, that's where you go. But even that is decoded. Often it's predominantly African American students. sometimes Latino students, Asian students don't often go to multicultural centers. Then if you happen to have a women's center, the women go there, right? So I think built into our structures and student affairs, I personally think there is a lot that asks students to choose what their salient identity is for them and walk through that door. And if you, as a woman who's an immigrant, who's a person of color, my salient identity could be any of it, at different times in your own development and your own growth. So I think there's a way in which everyone in all of these centers needs to do the work from an intersectional lens. I think when we talk about intersectional, it comes down to multiple identities, but it really isn't about multiple identities. It's really about how we are structurally organized that allows for students to maybe go to where they feel their needs are most met, but each of those spaces provide them with an opportunity to think more deeply and critically about the work in which they're involved or the work they're doing. We have organized for the first time a queer men of color group, about which I've been really happy because, it was really, really hard to get the men of color to be out on this campus. And it's fairly diverse. But I think a lot of it has happened because a couple of men were willing to take the leadership and to be out on the campus. A lot of it has been building personal relationships over time and allowing for that to flourish. The biggest challenge that I have and continue to have on this campus is mostly around trans and gender non-conforming students, because that's the hardest group to both have out on the campus, but also find support, to find language to support them. And again, our language around, identity-based language and a very male-female language sort of prevents institutionally, pushes against whatever work we may do with outreach.
Thank you very much for those thoughtful responses. We have another question. Our campus seems to gather the most resistance when it comes to conservative base within our local diocese, as well as watchdog groups like Cardinal Newman. How have you navigated these more conservative Catholic ideas or groups as you have moved forward with programming for your students? Any takers?
I think some of it comes back down to that alliance building, as I think we've all spoken a little bit about, just internal alliances, to have the support of your mission and ministry staff, have your go-tos that you can lean on in those kinds of situations. And of course, we want to be respectful, we want to be appropriate, and I think from an administrative angle, I think that's very appropriate. But at the same time, I think sometimes we do what we need to do in order to serve our student population and our community, and that might not be right for everyone else. But finding that fine line, that balance, can be very challenging, and I think those alliances, those relationships, both internal and also, branching out within our network, can be really, really helpful in walking that line and making sure that that the work continues.
Yeah, and I think for us, most of the work, most of that navigation is actually done by mission and ministry. And I think I've been very careful here to say that I'm an educator, not a theologian, and that I'm not, I'm not here as a clergy person, nor am I here as a theologian. Philosophically speaking, I'm not a person who's, so I'm really here as an educator, and sort of separating out the theological pieces from the educational pieces has been one way we have navigated that. We do, I constantly get letters of protest. I get people showing up on campus to protest. We get a lot of mail from folks who are upset, who feel that, we're not being a very Catholic institution, or that this is against our basic identity and mission. But I think, this is where it has been different for us in Georgetown, I think, because it is Georgetown, because it is in DC. I think there's a way in which it has allowed us to sort of do the work with a greater latitude and freedom than perhaps some other folks will do. But I think what has, overall, I think the approach and the language of framing all of the, so if you go look at even the October events, a lot of it is very education focused. So I try to avoid doing, the center officially does not do a lot of social events. So that has been one important way the university has been able to sort of justify or rationalize the purpose of the center. That this is not, and I never use the word advocacy, because it has always come to be about advocating for a lifestyle rather than about identity. And so to avoid that word and to just talk about that we are really, really here to meet our students where they are, as Stacy said at the beginning, and to help them make choices and decisions that they can make in an ethical fashion. And also to support some of the families through this process.
Yeah.
Thank you. Another question that we have is, our transgender students have difficulty with housing and restrooms. What have you done on your campus to create gender-neutral housing and restrooms?
Oh, that's $1 million question. A lot of that is going to depend on where you are. Now, DC has a strong human rights law in place, and that has helped us a lot because by law, we have to do certain things. But despite that, we do not have, and I don't believe we will have, gender-neutral housing. On the other hand, these are the gains we have been able to make on campus. We have been able to ask for and get that students can use their changed names on their Go cards, which are their identity cards, right? So to give you a simple example, if I want to go by Shiva rather than Shivagami, I can say I want to be Shiva on my Go card, because that's not a legal name change, because the identity card is only valid on campus. For us, at least, that populates the class rosters. And so that provides protection. And for me, the way we made that argument on campus, and it's not without its problems and challenges right now, was to say, think about the impact of this on the safety of our students. Because if I present as male and I have a female name, I'm not even safe entering the campus. I'm not safe even going into buildings where I'm not known. So it's really about very, very simple, fundamental safety. So we said the impact then on students is very tough, and we don't want to be liable for that, and we want to create safety for that. The other piece that was a more difficult conversation, and we're still in the process of having that conversation, is around rooming and housing. So currently, students can room with roommates based on their gender identity and gender expression. But the caveat for that has been that they will have to present as such 24/7. And as we all know in our experience, many students do not present the same way all the time. And but we have said, okay, but they can. So if I present 24/7 as male right now, I can ask to room with a male roommate, provided that that roommate consents. So that does mean having the conversation with the roommates. So this does not avoid the problem for the first-year students who don't know anyone, but it also means you have to out yourself to an administrator or to somebody else in housing. We are actually going to have a conversation with somebody tomorrow. I'm bringing together people from admissions, registrar, legal counsel, housing, residential living, campus ministry, to talk with Dr. Jenny Beeman, who's a very well-known trans researcher and scholar, to think through this in a more critical way on campus and to say, how can we offer something on our campus that will stay with our mission and values, but at the same time be a safer space for our students? Because, when I first got here, there was no out trans student. And the first 3 years, every single trans student I had transferred out. But now I have 12 out trans and gender non-conforming students. The trans students are actually easier. It's the gender non-conforming students who are even harder for us, but that is the growing population. They're already here. They're not using language that any of us know or are familiar with. It changes every 5 minutes. But again, I think this is going to be the real frontier and the tough frontier for us. And needless to say, I haven't even touched health insurance and health coverage. But at least for housing and names, we have made some significant progress.
Great. Thank you, Shiva. Anyone else want to respond to that question?
Sure. In my first or maybe the second year here, a student came to me because they had been misgendered on a form from the Office of the Registrar, and the Registrar was really open to creating different options in the software system for people to be able to identify name and pronoun that they wanted used on all the material. So we have that. We do by request housing. I really agree that one of the big challenges for us on campus is having students be out and visible. I've had a lot of conversations, a lot of movement and energy, and as often happens in the last 6 weeks of the senior year, somebody wants to make a change and develops a petition, and then a movement gets going, and then it doesn't get picked back up. So that's definitely been the experience so far. I think it's gradually growing. I think one of the things that helps a lot is the fact that in younger generations, this is especially among like the GSA and other campus communities for queer students or LGBT students, that this is really normalized for them. This is not like we are behind the curve, right? And so for them to be leading us and kind of pushing us forward is also helpful, because the students are just seeing it as an equity issue, as a safety issue. We did get some kind of short-term traction on maybe being able to move on bathrooms. That stalled because we had a leadership transition in the planning office, but I'm hoping that once we get through some other projects that the center has underway right now, that I'll be able to devote some more time to seeing that move forward, because we need it.
Yeah, speaking of bathrooms, the one strategy that has worked for us is to not use the term actually gender inclusive at all. So we just say single stall and just say this is just a restroom, right? And that's been a national trend, because some of this is language. Because I think when people hear gender neutral or gender inclusive, everybody freaks out, right? Because everybody thinks, oh my God, now I have to be in a room with other people and everybody can see me, although nobody can see you and nobody's interested in seeing you, as I say. So, but I think so. I try to get away from gender neutral and gender inclusive and just say, can we have single stall bathrooms, because those are the needs of students with disabilities, with students who have any other kind of needs for privacy, really, families, etc. And then to just re-sign all of that with just restroom. Just let's call it restroom, and that's it, but it'll all be single stall. So I think that's something that they will do. It's harder to retrofit older buildings. The newer buildings, it's all being done now. So we've got all the new buildings, all of that is in the planning process itself. I think where we are having real trouble is with retrofitting, especially dorms, older dorms that were built in the 60s and 70s, because they all tend to have bathrooms, in one ends of the stuff, and then it's very difficult.
Yeah. And I should mention, too, that one of our challenges is also that we, in general, are a campus that our accessibility is not good.
Yeah, neither is us.
Yeah, our physical. And so one of the things that I would like to be able to do that I have not yet been able to do very effectively is to partner with our Office of Disability Services to make sure that we're moving together on this, because it really is a
access issue.
It's an access issue, and it's a universal design issue.
Yeah.
I would just add to whoever asked this question, I think you're absolutely not alone. Like Shiva said, this is probably the million-dollar question, that big ticket item. I would say that from my experience at BC, this was probably the toughest issue, even just to have a conversation around. We really didn't have undergraduate students who, every few years maybe we would have somebody who would be at least somewhat out about their experience, but they were not out. Occasionally we would have a graduate student, but that would obviously be a little bit of a different conversation since they weren't residential. So it was a really, really tough conversation, and I think what that boiled down to, besides the safety issues that the others have mentioned, which I think is a mantra that we all need to continue to speak about, but it's really just education. I think a lot of folks don't understand what it means to be trans, or the many, many things that can mean, or the transition process for students who are going through that. Like Shiva said, it's not necessarily an all or nothing kind of a thing. It may take time, may take many years, or that may be the permanent state, that it's a fluid transition for folks. I think a lot of our very, very caring faculty and staff whose hearts were, I think, ideally in the right place, just didn't have the education and the information to really know how to go about having this conversation. And so for us, it was really on a more basic level. Okay, how do we begin the conversation amongst our own staff, amongst our faculty as well, to create that support and framework that we could then build from. So I would say whoever asked this question, you're right on the money. It's definitely something that we're all struggling with at a variety of different levels, as you've heard here.
Right, and theologically, I think it's the hardest because of our understanding, because they understand being gay and lesbian as being about identity. But this is a basic violation of the sacredness of the body. Mm-hmm. So I think because of that, even in some of the most thoughtful Jesuits with whom I have enormous numbers of really good conversations that have given us a better way to frame this has been very hard because it's sort of it's core to the Catholic belief in the body as a sacred vessel.
Yeah, I think one thing I would offer to that too is when the question got asked about mission, is one of the things that our mission partners say that has been useful is the university is the place where the church does its thinking. Mm-hmm. And so part of how, especially in some of the education that we've done in Safe Zone and just kind of generally educating about diversity, gender diversity, and thinking about what it means to talk about gender and sex and sexuality, is that people seem able to hold potentially theological messages or cultural messages they've gotten about the sacredness of the body, and also understand that people can have sacred experiences that are fluid. And so thinking about fluidity of gender, thinking about kind of breaking down some of the gender theory stuff, seems to be a space that people can hold as part of our job as educators, is to kind of expand people's understanding. And whether that, I don't know what the long-term impact of that kind of approach might be, and I would really, really love to have feedback about that. But that does seem to be a space that's provided some opening, is that although it's true that people may have or believe or work with the theology or the cultural messaging in a particular way, that if the university is a space where the church does its thinking, then it's actually appropriate for us to open up the space of conversation about gender theory and about gender identity, at least for now.
Thank you very much for those responses. We have a number of questions that have come through, so I just want to ask our panelists to be a little more brief in their responses. How do you foresee the new Jesuit Pope impacting the ability to engage LGBTQI students through not just a Jesuit lens, but also a Catholic lens?
I think it's going to get harder, personally. Because I think it may end up polarizing, especially if I've watched some of the recent events that have unfolded.
Okay. Can you give examples where you or the institution have judged a request not to be something that was reasonable to grant, and any tips on how to say no to something in this area?
No, I didn't follow the question.
Can you give examples where you or the institution have judged a request not to be something that is reasonable to grant, and any tips on how to give that message to the requester?
I wonder if this question is related to student programming, maybe? Around appropriateness of student programming. I'm not sure exactly what the nature of the question is.
Yeah, because
it didn't specify.
could answer that. I think using some of the language that Shiva's talked about earlier around kind of the difference between identity and behavior also, I think is an important difference for students, and positioning ourselves, as educators, like she said. I think being able to frame things for students in that way, I think can be very helpful. I'm not sure if that exactly addresses the question, but that's how I'm interpreting it.
Thank you. Shiva, this question is specifically for you. It says, what is the difference about the LGBTQ monthly Mass compared to the regular Masses or the other Mass?
We don't have Mass. What we have out of our campus ministry is a Jesuit runs a weekly discussion LGBTQ prayer group. So the students, and it's interfaith, so it's open to all Christian denominations, primarily Christian, but sometimes other students join in. So it started out as specifically Catholic, but last year they started doing it as just Christian prayer group. So students come together, they actually pray, they do a lot of things together, but they study together. So it's really run as an LGBTQ Catholic prayer group. It's not run out of the center, it's run out of campus ministry, and the person who does it is a Jesuit.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that question might have been informed by some of what's going on at Marquette, but there is a monthly Mass that is an LGBTQ Mass, so maybe that's what the person was asking about. It's run by campus ministry. The distinction is really just that campus ministry wanted to make sure that it was very clear and very welcoming to LGBTQ students who wanted to have a Mass and a space that they felt really welcomed and affirmed, particularly for students who are also Catholic, but also just in general, to be very clear that that all are welcome to celebrate at Mass and to have a space that's really intentional and very visible for that.
Great. Thank you. Have any of you experienced any issues with alumni or donors expressing anger over the adoption of progressive policies? And if so, how have you addressed them?
Oh, Lord. All the time.
Yeah.
The best answer is when you raise money from other alums. No, really. I mean, I think for every alum who has threatened us with cutting off funding, and sometimes when you go in and look at their record, there are people who have never given us anyway. We have been able to bring in 5 others, who have given and who have re-engaged the university. But I think, again, that depends on the institution and how much buy-in there is at the higher levels. Because when I first started doing the work with alumni outreach, there was a lot of that anger and fear and anxiety, right, that this is going to alienate a whole bunch of other alumni. And they didn't really want us there, and they really didn't want to do this in a sort of an official way. But then as we engaged a bunch of new alums who were disenfranchised, and many of them were very well-known and well-placed Hoyas who were very well-known in the world outside, I think, part of, the approach for me has been to say that many of these alums are people that we should be proud of, because they are, one of our alums is the founding president of one of the largest development organizations in the world. One of them is the head of a global health organization. A couple of them are, many of them are big achievers in the world outside, and they also happen to be gay. That's about it. But there's no reason why Georgetown shouldn't be as proud of them as they are of anybody else. So, but I think a lot of it has also been the relationship we have both with the Alumni Association, the Alumni Relations, and with the Office of the President. So those relationships have helped sort of keep that somewhat to a minimum, I think.
Thank you. Do you have any LGBTQ themed or gender neutral housing or collaborations with Residence Life?
No, no gender neutral. They will not use the term gender neutral. So that's what I spoke to about earlier. I don't think that's. I think that's one of those red flag terms, and I think that won't go anywhere on a campus like ours. So what we have been able to do is to the students tried several years to try and do an LGBT themed housing, But that didn't go through. We tried to do a housing on LGBT history, which would be open to allies, but that did not go through either.
Okay.
I mean, under living and learning communities, that's what I've been hoping for, that we can do something that would be part of a living and learning community.
Yeah, and we're currently talking with residents right now about doing, we've done general education for the whole RA, or RA staff,
Yeah.
And we may do safe zone training for RAs at some point in the near future. So,
have any of your campuses engaged in any inclusive climate studies outside the standard national surveys?
We are trying to pilot one now for this year. We are trying to do a campus climate survey. They had done one several years ago when actually the hate crimes happened. And when they did that, that's when they found that even more than race, the hate crimes against LGBTQ people, students, was the highest on this campus. And that was how the students, when they were organizing for the formation of the center, that was one of the biggest pieces of data that they used to say that the climate was most hostile for LGBTQ students, faculty, and staff.
Mm-hmm. We had a fairly recent, more broad diversity climate study that had some specific questions in it that were focused on the community. But it really didn't quite dig down to the level that I mentioned earlier about, really needing more data and really needing more understanding. It was always my dream that we could, have a survey that would be sent out to the entire campus as well, and not just to the community, to really ask about, what are you seeing and hearing out on the ground? What is that climate like in the classroom? In your residence hall, on a Friday night at a party, to really, really begin to understand that. And again, getting through to that point was not quite where we were yet when I left. But we did have some data to draw from that came out of a broader diversity climate study. So that may be an angle that might be an option.
It should be part of a broader campus climate or a diversity study, honestly, because I don't think there's a way to separate it out from anything else. And we shouldn't.
Yeah, we had in 2010 or 2011, after the Jody O'Brien issue on campus, Ronnie Sandlow came to campus and did an LGBTQ climate study. And, yeah, right now we're under contract with Sue Rankin to have a campus-wide survey that is going out this spring and hoping to have results next fall.
Right.
Great. Thank you. Can you discuss specific examples of how you're using Jesuits on your campuses for these initiatives?
So all over. So for me, it's everywhere. In classrooms, in running prayer groups, attendance at our events, having them sort of, they're really, for me, the sort of the voice, the theological voice at the center. In our work, we do a lot of, we do like weekly coffee hours, which happens every Friday, 3 to 5. And some of it it's very informal. Students come, and it's been very popular. But we invite sometimes faculty and staff to come in. The Jesuits show up for those things, and invite us to class. I do a lot of presentations. We do have a lot of Jesuits teaching here, so that has been helpful. And they also, in their classes, they teach, when they teach, whether it's in religion or theology or history or wherever, they are also talking about these issues. So I think that's been very helpful for us.
We have had one Jesuit who's trained in Safe Zone, who's very supportive, and then in general it's been difficult to develop those relationships and get engaged, but one of the things that the advisory board is looking at right now is to try to see if we could reconstitute the board a little bit so that we could have a permanent kind of ex officio role for a representative from the Jesuit community, but we'll just have to see how that grows.
I would say in my experience, there's been a lot of support within the Jesuit community. I would say, particularly here at Regis, I've had a lot of sort of good connections with Jesuits around talking about LGBTQ support. I think sometimes the challenge is getting those individuals to be more vocal about that support. I think it's there, and I think when students come in and have a one-on-one meeting, they feel it. There's that connection. It's really, really good. It's really helpful. But sometimes and for obvious reasons, I understand where it comes from, but I think sometimes that can be a challenge for not just Jesuits, but for campus ministry staff in general. To be able to be as vocal as they might otherwise like to be, I think, really depends on the political climate of your campus. So that's an additional challenge that I think I've encountered.
I think that's true everywhere, and I feel their role in pastoral care, especially in outreach to families, has been very important to me. Because, when I talk to a parent, it's different from somebody of clergy talking to a parent and telling them that their child is okay, I think that's a very powerful healing that I can never provide. So I think for me that care is very important.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Have you all had any success working with student athletes who identify as members of the LGBT community or as allies?
Yes and no. I got my first out athlete right now. And I've been talking to Sue Rankin actually to try and do a study within the Division of Athletics. So we'll see where that goes. But that is one of the major impetuses for Paul Tagliabue's gift.
We had a student at BC last year who was an out member of one of our athletic teams and was also connected with the national organization You Can Play, which does these really powerful videos both with professional sports teams as well as with lots of college campuses. And he was really trying to bring that connection onto the BC campus, and again we had, I think, a lot of support for it for a variety of reasons, and I think somewhat due to some leadership changes that project didn't quite see itself to fruition, but I think that's still on the table. And partnering with organizations like that, I know several of our peer institutions, I believe, does Georgetown have one? I'm not sure.
Yeah, we did one, yeah.
I know Notre Dame.
Notre Dame did a beautiful one.
Yeah, other Catholic campuses have had really good success with that.
Right.
That might be a nice place to begin as well.
Yeah.
Great, thanks. Recognizing the differences in institutional resources and climate, what are some of the basic resources or forms of support that we ought to offer to make our campuses welcoming and inclusive environments for the LGBT community? And what strategies do you have for getting those initiatives or those forms of support off the ground?
Mm-hmm.
I think right away that intersectional programs, to Shiva's earlier point, and I think as we've been talking about throughout the webinar, is making sure that everything that we're doing has that kind of intersectional lens from the beginning, and whatever work needs to happen either in the programs and projects or in your own professional development, wherever you're positioned, to be able to see that happen also requires some of the strong partnerships. But those are the two things that come to mind right away.
I would also say, you asked about basic resources. Very basic, I would say, just creating a space and some financial support and recognition for student organizations of whatever kind. I know all of our institutions are at very different places in regard to that, but I think that provides students with again, a very basic need to feel sort of heard, to feel recognized, to feel honored and a part of the greater campus community. And if that's not there, or the organization is there but there's no funding, I think that is a really hard thing for students to overcome. If they can't even, on a very basic level, just organize with one another and have a space to be together, whether that's through a resource center or just on their own, I think is a very base level kind of thing that our organizations can be doing. And I know that sometimes the conversation getting to that point can at times be tricky, but I think that that's a really important one.
Do you all have any advice with regards to how to balance supporting faculty and staff and students for those of us that are at merged centers?
I do work a lot with faculty and staff. We do have a faculty committee, an LGBT faculty committee on the faculty senate. And they were very involved even before the center came. They were some of the biggest people who worked with the students when the center was being formed. So they've always been a very strong voice in asking for, particularly around benefits issue. And so as soon as I came here, we did work with benefits, and the faculty were very vocal. And so we do have, the legally domiciled adult policy. We don't call it domestic partners, but that's what we call. But so that has been a very powerful group to advocate for all of that. When it came to, but I do a lot of work with, so we do a lot of work with them, we partner with them. But for the faculty, so having out faculty and staff has been the most powerful way for us to also help our students. And actually what helped for our trans students to be more visible too was the transition of 2 staff while they are on campus and finding a way to support them through their transition. And their being more out on campus really sent a very different message to the campus community, because then they had to sort of work with those 2 individuals. And I think, so for me, the most important and powerful role for faculty and staff is for them to be there as visible role models to our students.
I would say that in our retreat program, again, as I mentioned earlier, we were able to do that in a very visceral sort of a way. We would have faculty and staff mentors who would be part of the full retreat program. They would participate in the small group discussions that the students were having along with a very well-trained student lead. And then they would also sit on panels and really have opportunities to share with students their own voice and their own experience. And even more than that, through the weekend, what we would do is we would invite them to bring their partner or significant other or spouse or family, even in some cases. We had this one wonderful woman who would bring her wife and her 2 sons every time, and it was such, as Shiva said, to be a role model and just to have kind of downtime with adults, faculty and staff members was so incredibly powerful, and launched a whole network. I mean, I'd say if students were not connected when they went on this retreat, not only did they meet other students, but they would have this new network of faculty and staff people that they could go to, who were then connected to other faculty and staff people that they could go to. It was really, really powerful, and really not that difficult to pull off that piece of it. So I would say that, I agree 100% with what Shiva said, just really giving faculty and staff an opportunity to connect with students. And I think from the vantage point where we sit, we have the ability to do that. We're connected to both groups.
Yeah. And I would say, I think a part of the question around merge centers has just been, what's the priority and how do those priorities get set in collaboration with other partners on campus? And so one of the things that I've heard over and over again is that the faculty want kind of like curriculum support and have specific questions about, let's say, transgender social experiences, conditions, identities, and so if I can help them identify resources to get the information they need and just kind of be a conduit in that way, that is achievable with the other set of goals that the center has. And so I think, making some of those tough choices about priorities is probably the #1 way in terms of merged centers specifically of how to make sure that you're serving the constituencies that you're charged with. And because we do have a board, sometimes it's helpful to have that be a part when I do the report that I do at every board meeting to say, like, here's what I've done for faculty, here's what I've done for staff, here's what I've done for students, am I hitting the right balance, what are your thoughts? And just kind of keep that conversation open.
Curriculum challenges are the hardest, I think. So we don't have, we have a women's and gender studies program, and some LGBT classes are taught there, which focus on sexuality or queer studies, but it's not titled LGBTQ or queer studies. So DePaul and USF, as far as I know, are the only ones which have had that for a longer time.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. What role should JASPA and AJCU play to advance efforts on all of our campuses to make them more inclusive and supportive of LGBTQI communities?
I'm hoping that JASPA and maybe through the larger AJCU, the big AJCU, that we can really put this on the national agenda somewhere as part of saying that this should be a way for us, this should be part of our standards of practice, is to evaluate all schools. Not all schools need to or require, maybe, can afford to have an independent LGBT center, so it's not that, but to say that part of the way we sort of evaluate ourselves and our own ideals and our best practices is to at least have a staff person whose job function and responsibility will include in their official title LGBTQ, and to elevate that that piece of the work, because I think, and to make it really be part of like a CAS standard, like, we do, it is a CAS standard, and I think we follow that about a lot of things, and I think for me it would be really helpful to do that, and for JASPA to take the leadership in advocating that at HSCU level. And the second is really that all of our, when we do the 5-year institutes, when we do the yearly gatherings, that we do have at least a session or some conversation around LGBTQ issues alongside others in our conferences and in our calls.
I think JASPA in general, I think, is just a connector. I think it connects us all, and I know we spend a lot of time benchmarking with one another. There's a lot of time spent on the phone, what are you doing, what are you doing? And there are probably a lot better ways that we could be doing that, sharing information about our practices and our best practices, creating some forum, whether it's online or, as Shiva mentioned, at our regular gatherings for ongoing conversation in that area. I think that that's very powerful, and particularly now at a small institution, I want to hear from both of those doing the work at larger, more resourced institutions, as well as from other sort of similarly situated institutions. And I think JASPA can do that. I think JASPA can provide that forum to continue that conversation.
No. I agree with all of that. I don't have anything to add.
Okay. Earlier there was discussion about how support for trans students can be a little easier than support for gender nonconforming students. Even with students who might not identify as trans, lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, they can face resistance related to gender nonconforming behavior. Can you talk more about how you support these students on campus compared to students who might express in a more binary way?
It's been really tough. I've worked at a lot of different institutions, and I always joke, but only half jokingly say that Georgetown is the most gender-conforming campus I've ever been at, I always say this, right? I wear Indian clothes a lot, and I stick out a mile on this campus because everybody knows me because I'm in Indian clothes. That's how conforming it is, right? And so here, everybody dresses the same way. They're very conforming in their presentation, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity. I mean, what is scary to me is that everybody's like, they all shop in that same 6 places or something. So I just go off on this, and my students think it's really funny, but I think it's true. And so, because in no other campus that I've been at would anybody recognize me because I was in Indian clothes. I mean, not at all. So I think it's that culture. It's in the culture. So I think it makes it so hard for our students. I mean, at University of Maryland, where I worked for many years, lots of students will have purple hair, and they'll have painted fingernails, they'll have interesting clothing, not because they're gay, not because they're gender non-conforming, but because they were having fun. And they don't do that.
Yeah.
There is no diversity in dress. So we have to say that. I've been wanting to say that for a while.
Yes. I have changed my wardrobe, not just because I've gained some weight. Like, I have an entirely new wardrobe than I did 2 years ago, new professional wardrobe.
I mean, I've been an educator for 25 years. I never owned a blazer until I got to Jesuit. I think there is, wherever else we may have diversity, we have no diversity in dress.
Yeah.
And I think that is the single biggest factor, in all honesty, that makes the lives of gender non-conforming people the most difficult on this campus. So I don't think it has really got to do with trans issues in that sense. So I'll stop there because I'm like, I'll take off for the next 2 hours about it. Otherwise,
I agree with that. I think at Marquette it also shows up as having some impact on students who, like, so not only students who might want to have dyed hair, but like students who may want to come in, like, who enjoy hip-hop fashion or do, like, it's a very preppy, white, upper middle class, like students from lower income backgrounds, students who have families who are like coming and going, it's a very kind of normative culture in that way. So I think that's the challenge.
yeah.
Great. Okay, we have time for one last question before we give our panelists an opportunity for concluding thoughts. And this question is directed at Stacy. Stacy, you mentioned earlier having worked on a resource guide. What types of resources are included, and how do you ensure that it gets in the hands of the students who need it?
Yeah, so the approach that we took to our resource guide was not just really making it explicitly about LGBTQ issues, whatever that might mean, but really kind of casting it in a broader light around just sort of general student needs and general student issues. So there's a section in there around certainly the student organizations and various campus organizations, including the Faculty and Staff Association, contact info for all of those groups. But then there's also, the academic deans who we spoke with and said, can we list you as a resource for students? And it might just be about, I have a general academic question. I'm not going to come in and talk with you about my identity in any way, but I see you're on my list. I see that hopefully that means that you are going to be a welcoming individual, and I want to come in and talk with you. So that was the angle that we took on the guide. We did also include some off-campus organizations as well in the greater Boston area, both health-related organizations and sort of broader LGBT organizations in the area, just to make that connection for students. And then we took a lot of baby steps to get that into the hands of students in different ways. As I mentioned, while I was there, we were able to include that pamphlet for the first time in our Welcome Week folder, or excuse me, in our orientation folders that students would get during summer orientation programming. And again, it was really just about asking the question and being able to explain why that was important. But I think people got it, and sometimes just asking the question and asking it in a way that makes it seem very sort of common sense, I think can really go a long way. So that was one way we got it out to students. We also would work with offices across campus to make sure, again, creating that network and to make sure that they had copies available in a prominent location in their office. So wherever students might be for a variety of other types of issues or resources or needs, they would be able to encounter that publication. And then we had it online as well. It was a baby step process for sure, starting out just creating an online form, then creating a pamphlet, then printing more of the pamphlets, then getting it kind of more and more accessible to students, and that process continues. But I think just, again, having something that says, we recognize you. We have a place for you here in our community, and here are some resources, academic and social and otherwise, that might be helpful to you as a student in our community. I think was a powerful statement, and I think really was a good first step. There's more that I think can be done with that publication in terms of training. We actually have looked at Marquette's programs quite a bit around their Safe Zone training and their diversity advocates training as kind of other ways to give the people in the guide, make sure that they're fully competent and prepared to have those conversations in a very specific way. But I think just creating something and getting it out in the right places is something that can be really important. Basic, but important.
I think we'll jump ahead to any closing thoughts that you might have, or any sort of final things for the participants to hear.
I would.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Jiva.
I'd just say that, I really want to thank Jasper for this opportunity, and I really hope that people feel that there is no single way to do this. Every campus is different, every institution is different, and these are just different ideas and different approaches that people can take. And, I think sometimes there's a sense of feeling overwhelmed, especially when I go and do some presentations, because there's a sense of, okay, Georgetown is somewhere there off on its own, sort of being the sort of the rogue among schools. But I think it took a lot of years, before the center happened. We had a half-time person, a full-time person, so it had gone through all those avatars. But I think the most important thing for me would be that the fact that we're having this conversation, the fact that there is interest, and hopefully that people will feel free to email or to ask questions of me or whatever I can do to help or to foster, I'm happy to do.
I would second that. Thank you also for this opportunity. I agree. I think small changes matter. I think social justice is not always achieved through broad brushstrokes. I think sometimes it can happen in small baby steps, and it's important just to start making some broad, small baby steps wherever you can, and wherever that happens. I think we also touched earlier on kind of the notion that language and semantics can really matter. So figuring out what the buzzwords are on your campus, both good and bad, and figuring out how to work with those, or work around those, or work within those. I think that understanding that language piece can be incredibly powerful, and sometimes the same concept by a different name or with a slightly different framework or with different partners involved in it can really move a project forward in a way that it might have kind of stalled out otherwise. So just some closing thoughts I think to think about from my angle.
Yeah, I would echo that and really appreciate also the opportunity to join at a later date into the webinar, but also the fact that the conversation is happening at a national level is just hugely exciting to me. And I'm just really grateful for the expertise of the colleagues here. I think many of the folks who probably call in have a longer history with Jesuit education than I do, so it's I'm grateful for the chance to be part of the conversation. And I think the other thing that I would say is if there are folks on the call who are somewhat new to this context or environment, it's been very helpful to me to really shift how I think about social justice, how I think about all the terms that circulate in this work, and to really move into a different space and trying to enter a much more collaborative approach in the work than maybe I'd encountered at previous institutions. And so that's been a helpful piece of advice for me that I think I probably got from Shiva and many of the people that I worked with on this campus, and would just pass that along if there's anybody on the call for whom that resonates.
On behalf of the webinar committee, I just want to say thank you to our panelists, and thank you participants just for joining us. I would encourage you, if you're with a group or if you know some other people that were listening, continue the conversation, continue to talk about this. The only way, as they mentioned, the only way change is going to happen is if we, as colleagues and as a force, raise this issue and try and make some subtle and small changes that will lead to a big change. We did record this webinar, and so it will be up pretty soon, in a day or so, on the JASPA website. And then we'll be sending out a survey to all those who are registered just to ask for your feedback and any suggestions that you have for future webinars. So I hope you all have a wonderful day, and thank you so much for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.